So here's the thing. Life in the Great Depression is really, really depressing, and it's a terrible reality for a lot of people. Because listen, you got to start right here in the center of the screen. Between 1930 and 32, there are huge problems. Businesses are closing in tremendous numbers. A quarter of Americans are out of unemployed. But what we need to understand is that things are so different than they are now. And spread around that center bullet point are the realities that people are facing. If you're hungry during this time, you don't get food stamps. You get bread lines, or you get soup kitchens, or you go hungry. And more importantly, these things are run by private groups. They're not run by the government. These are average churches or private groups doing this. Housing. There's no Section 8 housing. There's no housing assistance. If you're unemployed, you don't get unemployment insurance. So if you can't pay your rent, you can't pay your mortgage, you're tossed out of here. In the coronavirus crisis, Pennsylvania had to pass laws that said we couldn't do this because people were unemployed. These are the realities people are facing. Shanty towns grow up, and you can see an image of one right there. Outside cities and in cities, they call these things Hoovervilles after President Hoover because people blame that man for their problem. This is a depressing life. We're talking one room shacks, we're talking a water pump shared by all of these families, no bathrooms or sanitation, dirt floors. We're talking the terrible conditions that people were living in the places they were before they were immigrants here coming to America 40 years before. This is the level of poverty that we're seeing in places. Central Park in New York City, Hooverville. These are the realities. And it's not that Americans weren't trying. Many Americans were doing whatever they could. Teenagers, 15, 16, 17, adults were leaving their families, hopping on train cars called hobos, and they were going from town to town looking for work. They weren't degenerates. They weren't looking for handouts. They just wanted a job. But nothing existed in the government to help give them that job. Do you remember why? It was that idea, laissez faire. Remember laissez faire, that the government won't involve themselves in anything going on in the economy? Well, this is the result of that. This is what happens. A government that doesn't give you unemployment insurance, a government that can't give you food stamps, a government that can't stop you from getting evicted, a government that can't find you a place to live, a government that can't get you a job. Desperate for people to blame, Americans were looking at whoever they could to blame, whether it was President Hoover or even in some cases, like in the American Southwest, white Americans, racist, blamed Latinx people and then forcefully deported them, kicked them out for no reason other than the fact that they were thoughtfully. And it wasn't that they were Mexican, they just looked Mexican. Whatever that even means. These people were American citizens. That's the reality that we're seeing here, as people were desperate to blame folks for whatever it was that they could to find a solution to their problems. And it wasn't just in big cities or in little places like right here in Pennsylvania. This was a nationwide problem. And it was even worse for some people depending on where you lived in the country. If you lived in the Great Plains, the whole place that you lived in, whether it was Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, you can see the map there that I put down on the screen. That's the Great Plains. You lived in some place called the Dust Bowl. 10 years of drought and dust storms from over farming land that had once been held in places by grass but had been removed to farm destroys huge swaths of the country. I'm talking like the greatest environmental disaster our country has ever seen happens to the people living in these states during the Great Depression. Talk about adding insult to injury. Lots of these farmers who had been suffering from falling profits because they overproduced, because they had defaulted on their debt, are just broken by this Dust Bowl. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to search for, open up a new tab, pauses, search for dust storms or Dust Bowl 1930s. And if you do that, you're going to see these enormous black blizzards. It's crazy. There'll be a video clip coming up in here in a couple of seconds of the black blizzards and people who survived them. But the idea that these dust storms could blot out the sun entirely, listen, you could be suffocated. Creatures, cows, cattle, horses, anything else outside, kids, adults, if you were out in the open, you had a real risk of suffocating. And these things would come by once a week. I'm not talking like once in a blue moon. There were like 50 of them a year for 10 years. these farmers who were broken, forced to turn over their farms to the banks, they're wiped out. Many of them would head to California hoping to start for a new life. But I got to be honest, when they got to California, they discovered that a lot of these people in California were looking for jobs. In other words, there just weren't jobs no matter where you would go, and you were broken. This is the kind of reality that Americans are facing in the Great Depression, and it is a harsh